Hey everyone. I just want to talk about a couple of things before I get started here. First off, what you're about to watch are my lectures from week 15 that I recorded last year in 2021. But there's a reason why. Uh, this isn't just a matter of running out of time or laziness or what have you. I I usually watch my old recordings before I record my new lectures, uh, so I can remember what it was I said, make sure that I don't leave anything out that I mean to say in the new lecture. Um, and I did that this time, just like I've done in the past. And here in week 15, as you're about to see, we're going to dive into postmodern art, which takes us very much up to the current era. And it's an era of art that I absolutely love, right? uh, and I get pumped talking about it. And so as I was watching this, I was like, I already seeing myself in this video as pumped up as I am to talk about this stuff. Um, I was already thinking to myself, I don't know if I can bring that same energy right now, you know. Then in in part two of this of the lecture, we get into the work of postmodern and contemporary African American artists. And at the time that I was recording this last year in 2021, you may recall yourself in 2020 and 2021 all that was going on with conversations about race in the United States. Uh, the George Floyd incident and everything that followed that was still fresh, was still very much on my mind as I was making this recording. And watching this brought me back to that moment. And I thought to myself, I don't know if I can build myself back up to that again. And yet with hearing that passion in my voice and relating, hearing myself relate the work of these artists from the 80s, 90s, early 2000s to what was going on at the current moment, I realized I didn't want you guys missing out on that kind of conversation. And I fear that in my new headspace where I'm at in 2022, I may not have been able to give that to you. On top of that, I, at the time I had made, I am hesitant to bring any sort of a political discussion into this because I don't think there should. I don't think there should be something that is a political issue, but it seems sadly to be. At the time that I recorded this last year, there wasn't yet this weird obsession with whether or not critical race theory is being taught in schools and whether or not it's being woven deceptively into the curriculum in order to sort of, I don't even know what it is that those who bring it up as a straw man to punch at or what have you, what it is that they believe is going to happen if critical race theory is discussed. But that wasn't even a thing that was coming up at the time when I recorded this last year. And I noticed as I was watching this that some of what I go into in that second part of the two-part lecture, some of that stuff is the very kind of stuff that I hear people wanting to call critical race theory. I don't think it is at all, but I hear people pointing to the kinds of things that I was saying in that video and being like, this is critical race theory, this is murder, this is... And it just made me resolved all the more that I wanted to give you this. Now, I'm not trying to influence anyone's sort of political leanings whatsoever. You might even be hearing me say this and trying to guess which direction I lean politically. And let me just say, I'm very much a centrist when it comes to politics. But I do think this argument about what critical race theory even is and the sort of boogeyman mentality that it's everywhere and that everyone's trying to inundate us with it and that we're all trying to influence the younger generations to become woke snowflakes is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. There is a long history of racism in the United States built into its very core. And the way to move beyond it, move past it, isn't to ignore it and act like it isn't there, but instead to discuss it, discuss the history of it, discuss how it still is sort of woven into the systematic fiber of how we do things, and then see if there are ways that we can confront and make changes. Simple as that, really. And so those kind of conversations end up coming up in this lecture. And hearing myself say them not informed by all of this new political landscape that's so scared and of any sort of discussion of race racism and race relationships in this country, in this society. And hearing my discussion in this thing completely uninformed by any sort of zeitgeisty ideology that was something we shouldn't be talking about. I like the purity of that, and I want to keep that in as well. So forgive my rambling preamble here, but I just wanted you to understand those things, all right? So I guess to a certain extent, here's sort of a disclaimer. There will be conversations, not right away, but later on in the lectures, there will be discussions about race and race inequality and artists who address those very things. And understand again that the George Floyd incident and everything that followed that up was still fresh in my mind and still weighing heavily on my heart when I was recording this, which is why I want to keep it the way it is. So know that I'll make references to things that happened last year. That the last year that's being referred to would have been 2020. If I tell you the age of any of the artists, know that you should just add a year to that. All right. Thank you for putting up with me. All right. Without further ado, let's do this thing. Week 15. So, hard to believe, but here we are at week 15 of the semester, our last week of lectures. We have this week and then finals week. That's it. That's all that's left. We are there. We are at the final countdown, as they say. So we're going to dive into postmodern and contemporary art. But as it says here, I'm going to ask you to read anything this week. It's the last week of class. You're getting material from both Professor McIntosh and myself. Professor McIntosh has all that, the literature that she wants you to read. I figured I'll give you a break here. We are going to look at postmodernism. So we are looking at every artist that we're going to look at today is either alive, or if they're not alive, they died tragically young. Because we're going to be looking at art that's been produced over about the last 40 or so years. So we are getting right up to the current era. But there have been arguments over the last decade of whether or not we're moving into something beyond postmodern. And so the last decade, let's say, people haven't put a firm hold on it just yet. We're still kind of working out what that was. And so this is going to take us up to the early 2000s, maybe just a little bit into this past decade, the 2010s. But generally, we're going to be looking at the late 70s, 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. And the youngest of our artists that we have is sort of in his mid 40s, and because anybody who's much younger than that, their place within art history hasn't been firmly established just yet, right? So we're going to look at people who we know to be important to the history of art. So since we're diving into postmodernism, all right, I do want to dive into a few terms. What exactly postmodern art means. So postmodernism was a movement in Western art spanning from the late 1970s until recent years, which rejects the key ideas of modernism. And I say until recent years because there are arguments as to whether or not the art that's coming out right now is indeed postmodern, or if we've moved on into something else. Pluralism, at least when we're talking about in postmodern art, this is a term that has other definitions elsewhere. But in postmodern art, pluralism is this philosophy that assumes that the cultural context of art should be all-encompassing in its respect for the art of the world's wide variety of cultures and artistic styles. Very different from what we've been doing thus far, right? Where we've just really been looking at Europe. Right? We get into postmodernism, and the art world becomes less divided and much more global. Appropriation, right? This is a term we already used once, if you recall. We used this already in talking about the earliest modernism back in the 1800s. When we talked about Manet and his appropriation. I mentioned to you then that it was going to kind of go away for a while and then it would come back. It came back in pop art for sure. We're going to see it continue and really get pushed to greater heights in the postmodern era. It's an artistic concept in which the artist uses an image already in existence and places it in new context in order to give it new meanings. And pastiche. Okay, so don't get these two words confused with one another. They're similar, but they're not the same thing. A pastiche is a type of appropriation. But not all appropriation is pastiche. All right. So pastiche is an artistic work in a style that imitates that of another work, artist, or period. Right? So those sound very similar, and it's because pastiche is a type of appropriation. So what brought about the postmodern art movement? Well, modern art, you'll recall, was founded on the idea of breaking the rules, break all rules. But eventually there were no more rules left to break. So what do you do? So Also, around at the same time, we're talking more in like the 60s and 70s, but these philosophers would have a big effect on the new generation coming along in the late 70s and into the 80s. There were these postmodern philosophers, people like Jacques Derrida, Jean Baudrillard, and Michel Foucault, who, in their philosophies, one of the things they were beginning to do, and this is a hallmark of postmodern philosophy, was they were starting to reject binaries or either or classifications. And what exactly do I mean by that? Well, sorry, my webcam. All right. Binaries. This is a thing that we really like to do in Western culture for some reason. It's a very Western thing, where we take everything in the world, in the universe, what have you, and we try to split everything into two categories. Often with one category being considered the more important one, the one that is worthy, and then the other one is not so much. Right, like things like up, down, good and evil, left and right, man and woman. Right, we love to take things and split them in two, and at least kind of pretend that nothing exists in between those two extremes, right? And like I said, we like to assign value to one over the other, right? I mean, the fact that your grades are going up, that's a good thing. If your grades are going down, that's a bad thing. Right and left, right? Like for the longest time, those who were left-handed were considered evil. Right? There's a reason why when something is correct, we say that it's right, and your rights, as in the things that you are entitled to, your rights are called rights. And there's a reason why the word sinister, meaning something evil and wrong, gets its root from the Latin word for left, right? So we have a tendency to do that kind of thing. But in postmodern philosophy, there are these philosophers who are starting to break that down. In particular, we have Jacques Derrida, who also came along and says that the world is full of what he called signs. Signs. These are the images, objects, text, and language that surround and inform us. And he says the meaning of these signs varies depending on the context in which we encounter them. And as such, meaning then, he says, is not fixed in art, performance, literature, etc. Let me pause here because this may sound strange. So Derrida says the world is full of signs. What are signs? Signs is everything. It's all of the stuff that surrounds us, as well as the text, the language we speak. It's all the stuff, and it's around us, and it informs us. But as it says here, the meaning of them, because we assign meanings to these things that we're talking about, but those meanings change if we change their context. And I know, a difficult thing to wrap your mind around. Let me put it this way. When you are in the classroom at Bethel, right, you walk into a classroom, and there are chairs and desks in that classroom. They're all pointed a certain way. Okay? Now, you're walking into that classroom with a certain expectation. There's a context to why you're walking into that classroom. Right? This is the place you're going for a specific class. And the classroom is set up in such a way as to be as conducive as it can be to learning. So you walk in and you see that chair and that desk, and you don't really have any strong feelings toward those things, right? Why? Well, because they're in their correct place. They're where they should be. Other than seeing them as a place to sit down, we don't necessarily think much more about them. They're just objects. They're just stuff, right? Because they're in the place they should be. They're pointed in a way that they should be. They are where we always encounter them, right? So we hardly even think about them. Like I said, other than to, hey, which one of these am I going to sit down in today? Well, normally when we're in the classroom, when this class that I am teaching right now, when the English 202 class is in the classroom and not learning online, I will often ask the students to tell me some place that you really enjoy going to. Like, what is a place that you go to and you just kind of need to get away from it all? Where's the place you go for comfort, for relaxation, to just kind of forget about your worries and troubles, right? I'll ask that, and ideas get thrown back at me. I like to go to the beach. I like to go to the mountains. I like to go and fishing on the lake. I had one student one semester who said they really like going to the grocery store as a means of like getting away from it all. And like, okay, sure, I get it. So what I'll do, I'm going to ask you to just kind of hold in your mind right now what that place is for you, right? Whatever that place that you go to get away from it all, that going there makes you happy, and that's why you go there, right? And once you have that imagined in your mind, I'm just going to use the beach for an example. Let's say now that you go to that happy place of yours, in my case I'm just mentioning the beach, and upon arriving at the beach, suddenly, out there on the sand or wherever you're imagining, there's a chair and desk from one of your classes at Bethel. It is recognizably, it's the right colors, it's got the right type of wheels on the bottom, right? It's that laminate top, right? It's got the locked wheels on the bottom, whatever like desk you're accustomed to in your classes. And it's there in that place that you go to get away from it all. It's just there, right? And I ask the students then, and I ask you now, how would that make you feel? And like usually the reaction is, like, no, I wouldn't like that. That would piss me off. Like, what is that doing there? That's like messing with my peaceful place that I go to. And like, why? Why does it make you mad? Why would just some inanimate object sitting on the beach that when you encounter it at school doesn't bother you at all, suddenly put it here and it pisses you off? You're mad at it. You hate it. And it's because we have assigned certain meanings to it. And when it's in a certain context, those meanings make sense. But once it's on that beach, it brings with it all the stuff that we don't want coming into our space where we go for happiness. Right? It has all those connotations of school, of having to sit and learn. It brings all that with it, and it changes the meaning of that object, and it changes the meaning of the place that it's in, because now that place has been sullied, right? And now this object that I don't even give a thought about when I walk into a classroom encounter it is suddenly an object that I'm very angry and mad at and can't stand because of the fact that it's now here. That's a crude representation of it. That's kind of what's being talked about here. And there are a lot of postmodern artists who encounter these philosophies and they're like, "Oh yeah, I get it. I like this." And so we're going to start seeing a lot of this in art of the time. Also, the post-industrial age, or what is often referred to as the information age, gets launched at this time, right? Where suddenly there is this quicker and freer exchange of ideas and culture on a global scale, the likes of which we had never seen before this time. And the information age is only speeding up as we go. Right? We can really start to say information age gets launched in like the 70s, right? But it just keeps pushing and pushing, and the boundaries keep getting pushed further and further out, and as each one gets broken as we go. And so to the point that now information and ideas can be exchanged near instantaneously. What what else might we dive into? Well, by the time we get to this point in history, and even into the current day as well, there is no longer any one center of the art world. It's no longer in Paris, no longer in London, no longer in New York, but it's sort of instead there are many cities around the world that have flourishing art scenes. And sure, there are still some that people look to: New York, Chicago, LA here in the United States, still kind of Paris and London in Europe. In Asia, you're going to be looking at Tokyo to a certain extent, Seoul in Korea, Beijing in China, Sydney and Melbourne in Australia, Johannesburg in South Africa. Right, so they're like big cities with art scenes, but it's not as if there aren't these other smaller ones that are still considered important throughout the world. There's a flourishing art scene in just here in Tennessee, in Memphis, and in Nashville. Chattanooga, it's burgeoning a bit more in Chattanooga. Right, so we get these smaller art scenes, even locally. Right, we're not always looking to some other bigger place to tell us what art should be. Now, listen, there's this new generation of artists who are coming up, having been told by the modernists, who are now the ones who are kind of in control of things, right? That you should be breaking the rules, break the rules, break the rules, break the rules. And they're like, well, you already broke them all. What am I supposed to do? And they started looking at the art of the modernists and saying, look, modernism has just become purely art about art. It's just art for art's sake. It had become too focused on itself. And as such, they considered it to be elitist because it was just artists making art that they thought other artists would understand. The postmodernists are going to come along and say art should be a matter of personal expression. They want to see that in their work, personal expression, because that's kind of been getting away from that in modernism. If you really think about, like I said, the one that really kind of breaks it all is minimalism and post-minimalism to an extent, right? There's not a lot of personal expression there. There's not even much room for it. They want their work to express social causes, and whereas, remember, the modernists, the whole thing about the modernists was to like slough off the past, forget about the past, right? It shouldn't have anything to do with this new and modern world that we live in. The postmodernists start saying, no, we want to look back. We want to rediscover our art historical legacy. That continues to this day. It's still sort of a thing amongst artists to want to recognize that we don't make art in a vacuum, but that there are all these great artists who came before us on whose shoulders we stand. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we want to make art. We can look back at those who did it before us. We can take lessons from what they did, and then, as much as we possibly can, try to make something new out of it, while recognizing that it's kind of actually impossible to ever make anything truly and purely new. It's a very different mindset from the modernists. The art world was at this time, and still is, flourishing as art has become a value commodity that is traded in a global market that is really not unlike the stock market. There are auction houses. There are what are referred to as biennial exhibitions that happen all around the world that artists want to get their work into, because once they are in there, suddenly, boom, that artist is now considered valuable, and now people are going to start competing to spend money on that artist. It's very stock market like. So what are the characteristics of postmodern art? Well, as I say so often, with any of the movements that we've looked at. Postmodern art varies widely, but we do have a few characteristics that are common enough that we can note them. Appropriation being a big one. Appropriation of pre-existing imagery. There's a lot of artists who are going to take something that already exists and recontextualize it because they've been paying attention to the things that Derrida wrote about. Skepticism, right? Toward authority and the notion of empirical values, meaning that there is a clear right and wrong, and that there is an authority who gets to say what is right and what is wrong. Right? There's a huge amount of skepticism toward that way of thinking amongst postmodernists. Postmodernists also will bring in a lot of irony into their work, often humorous irony, which then brings me to the next thing here: humor, often sardonic humor. I thought I had an additional note about that. There's going to often be humor. A lot of it will be sardonic in postmodern art. The humor is usually biting. Then the use of text as the main subject. You can see that happening in this piece here to the right. Because of Derrida's ideas about signs and context and just text in general being something that it can be kind of wibbly wobbly in how we interpret and how meaning can be slippery when it comes to that, there are a lot of artists who dig that, and so they're like, well, why can't I just make art that is text? Right? A lot of this work is going to communicate the artist's interest in his or her art historical legacy. There's a lot of work that we'll look at that very directly is looking back at artists who came before. Right? And cultural blend. Right? There's not this insistence that art needs to come from one culture. Art doesn't have to just be Western in nature. It doesn't have to just be American in nature. It can cross cultures. It can blend cultures. You can have that plurality that we talked about earlier. An artist can want to take inspiration from, say, Leonardo da Vinci, but also looking at the the anime scene in Japan and comic books in the United States, and maybe some obscure like wrestler in Brazil or something. Right? People can reach, artists who say, look, I can take inspiration from all this stuff. I love it all. It's part of who I am. Why can't I incorporate it all into my work? And if that sounds like, well, duh, of course. Why would it be any different than that? Well, you have to understand, these artists are the ones who have paved the way for us to think that way now, right? Because they're dealing with the modernists who had become, in their minds, very elite and closed off. And postmodernists want to open their arms a bit more. So let's look at the beginnings of postmodernism. Specifically, let's look at how the earliest postmodern artists are going to think about context as creating meaning. So Cindy Sherman, she was born in 1954. She's still alive and is still a highly sought-after artist. She holds the record for the largest bid ever made on a piece of artwork by a woman. Excuse me, in the auction houses. I didn't recheck this. She may have done better than this by now, but she had one of her photographs that went for $9 million, and that sounds huge. But there are men who have gotten a whole lot more than that. But Cindy Sherman, she's a photographer, and she has made an entire career out of self-portraits, taking photographs of herself where she changes her appearance. And each series kind of has its own reasons for why she's changing her appearance, how she's doing it. Early in her career, in the late 70s and into the early 80s, she was doing the series that she referred to as untitled film stills. These are photographs. Again, they're self-portraits. That's her in the image there. And her goal with these was to appropriate, right, the visual language of old movies. Not all of them old movies, just movies in general. Right? But of course, she's making these in the 70s, so it would have been movies from the late 70s, early 80s, and before. They're meant to look as if they could have been one still frame from an old movie. And she did them in such a way as to try to bring attention to the ways in which women are portrayed in film. I don't know why my webcam is being so weird. I guess you're just going to see me at some weird angle here. She wanted to bring attention to the way that women are portrayed in film. Right? That women are often portrayed as stereotypes and not as full-fledged characters. Now, there's still a little bit of that today, although a lot of it has been rectified. But in the 80s and before, you go back and women are just kind of set dressing for movies. And so she would take these stereotypes, these archetypes, and inhabit them herself. Put herself into it and then put the work out there and then dare you to say about her that she is any of these things, right? So like this one here of like the young girl who's like sitting at home in her like sexy loungewear with mirror in hand, pining over some boy who's either, I don't know, off to war or just what is he out there doing while I feel so alone, like that kind of thing. Right? but then she dares you, like she takes on that persona and owns it and has like a little bit of solidarity with that young woman. Like, I feel you. Right? Okay, fine. You're a stereotype. You're a stereotype that men created, but fine. I'm going to identify as you. And then I'm going to put it into new context because I'm putting myself in here rather than the young actress who may have played such a thing in the past. And I'm going to dare you, now that I've changed the context of this, are you going to look me in my face and say that I'm this, like, the dumb bimbo or what have you, if you will? And she did tons of these. This is one where, she's clearly meant to be the young woman in the horror movie that's running away from the slasher movie killer who has now tripped and fallen and is too dumb to get up and like run away. So the slasher killer catches up, right? Like she is simultaneously making fun of these stereotypes and tropes from these old movies, bringing our attention to the fact they are stereotypes and tropes and should be considered offensive to women, and identifying with the women, like putting herself in those shoes, and daring you to say that this is her, right? If you would say, "Oh, that dumb chick couldn't get up off the ground and run away from from Jason or Freddy or whoever, she deserves to die," right? Like that. Are you going to say that to Cindy Sherman, who's sitting here and creating something and putting it out here like this? Right? All those things are mixed up because of the change of context, right? Sherry Levine, love Sherry Levine. She was born in 1947 and is still alive. This is a piece of hers called Untitled, after Walker Evans from 1977. Right, so she is a photographer as well. The way she explains it is she was getting really sick of in the 70s, and Cindy Sherman was dealing with this too, and that's kind of why she was making the work she was making, because a lot of photographers were men, and many of them sort of saw photography as being a male-driven discipline, and did not want to take women seriously in this art form, right? And so Sherry Levine was getting really sick of every time she was putting out her work of, again, the generation before her, who would have been modernists, telling her, yeah, like what you're doing with your photography, yeah, that's cute and all, but you should really be looking back at the great modernist photographers and start taking lessons from them. Photograph like they do. Right? And one of those would have been Walker Evans. So Sherry Levine says, all right, fine. I will photograph like one of the old masters. So this is I keep trying to say Cindy Sherman. Sherry Levine's photograph after Walker Evans. And this is the original photo by Walker Evans called Sharecropper's Family, Hale County, Alabama, from 1936. So again, here's Sherry Levine's photograph, and here is Walker Evans' photograph. Sherry Levine, Walker Evans. If you find yourself having a difficult time being able to tell any differences between these two photographs, well, there's a very good reason for that. Because again, Sherry Levine is getting sick of being told, hey, you should photograph like the great modernist photographers. So she says, you know what, fine, I'm going to do it. I will do exactly as you're suggesting to me, right? And she goes into museums, and she gets printed books that have Walker Evans photographs in them, and she literally points her camera at the photograph by Walker Evans, prints that, puts it on the wall of the gallery with her name signed on it, and calls it After Walker Evans. And she says, there it is. I have literally photographed just like Walker Evans, right? Like there's literally what you wanted is there. Like you told me photograph like Walker Evans. There it is. I mean, I can't get much closer to photographing like Walker Evans than that. The problem is not that you want me to photograph like the modernist. The problem is that I am a woman and that you have a problem with that. So I can take this masterful photograph. It is exactly the same photograph that you have bragged on and that you've talked about what a great example of American modernist photography this is. It's literally the same image. But if I put my name on it and stick it in a gallery, that's the thing that then reduces its worth. If I change that little bit of context, suddenly you want to point to it and say it's worthless. Sherry Levine, I love her snark. Right? So you see that irony, not only the appropriation, not only the changing of context, but that irony that we talked about as one of the distinguishing characteristics of postmodernism. Like there's an irony here, and a certain amount of humor. The idea that she would just go out like take a photograph of someone else's photograph and then put it up here like this, right? There's some humor to that, but certainly that irony, right? Like how ironic is it that you tell me a photograph like this, and when I do it, but put my name on it, that's when you consider it of less worth. Another great postmodernist of the early postmodern era is Jean-Michel Basquiat. Excuse me while I crack open a can. I had two of them here because my throat is parched. He first began making himself known through this graffiti that he starts doing in the late 70s into the early 80s that he signs Samo, S-A-M-O. Right? So for a long time, nobody knew who was putting this stuff out there. Right? People would get up and they would see some new graffiti on a wall somewhere that was signed Samo with the copyright symbol out next to it. And people were liking the poetic nature of them. They liked the wittiness of what was being written. And as you see, again, most of them were just text. Every now and then there might be some imagery in it. But it turned out Michel Basquiat and a friend of his were the ones responsible for this. And so once that was sort of discovered, that it was this young kid in New York who was up to this stuff, people started paying attention and wondering what might become of it. Well, Turns out, and this is presented in a film called Basquiat. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's a really great film biography of Jean-Michel Basquiat. He managed to run into and meet Andy Warhol, as you can see down here in the lower photograph, who by this point was getting up in age. He meets him, shows him his artwork, tries to wheel and deal and get Warhol to buy some of his artwork. And Warhol reported he was really impressed with the guy's attitude. He was impressed with it all. And so he started helping Basquiat out, got him into some exhibitions, gave him some advice. He started saying things like, hey, paint bigger. Right? Paint, get away from the graffiti, paint big. Let's see what you can do. Because the things he was showing to Warhol was like this big, like these little pieces. He was like, paint big. Let's get you something that can go into the galleries and we'll get people interested. He even at one point, as you can see here, did an exhibition where they did a joint exhibition together where Warhol would do one of his pieces, as you can see here, the big GE symbol, and then Basquiat would come in and paint right over the top of it. So Basquiat's work is very postmodern in its nature. It looks back in history. In this case, this is the Horn Players in 1983. This is a piece he did about the Harlem Renaissance. So it looks back at history and it appropriates. And all of this text that's all over it, right? Where each person's name, either their name is written out, crossed through, flipped around, almost kind of hip-hop style in a way, a sort of visual hip-hop, if you will, or it's alluded to. Like here we got Dizzy Gillespie, right? That name's getting written, although his actual name, rather than his nickname Dizzy Gillespie, is written here and it gets crossed out and blotted out. But then over here we have ornithology, alchemy written all over and over again. That's because this is Birdman, right? And ornithology is the study of birds, right? So there's this kind of play. And then the multicultural nature of it, right? Jean-Michel Basquiat takes the languages of the long history of Western painting, going all the way back to the Renaissance. You may not necessarily see that so much here, but I'll show you when we get there. And graffiti, right? The aesthetic language of graffiti, as well as he's sort of looking back at kind of like, not unlike the way that the Harlem Renaissance did itself, looking back at sort of ancestral, tribal African art and incorporating some of that language in as well. So you can see this piece here, the Mona Lisa, where he's just straight up appropriating the Mona Lisa. Right? So he's looking back in art history. He's looking back at the greats that came before him, paying homage to that. Whereas again, the modernists would have wanted to like push that away, forget about the past. He's incorporating again very graffiti-esque mark making, the aesthetics of ancestral, tribal, African art, all that being combined into and the text by drawing around the Mona Lisa here, all of the kind of information and text and numbers that would be on a dollar bill. Now there's a reason for that, because Michel Basquiat, he emerges on the scene with this stuff. This was so unique. People weren't accustomed to seeing work that looked quite like what Basquiat was doing. And he had the backing of Andy Warhol, of course. And suddenly, Basquiat went from dirt poor broke to extremely wealthy. The money was just coming in like crazy. And many believe that his tragic early death by overdose was in many ways the result of that this huge amount of money that suddenly came into his life and him not quite knowing how to handle that influx of cash and people taking advantage of it and his own sort of addictions and abuses. And sadly, he didn't live long enough for us to really see what he might have been capable of. He didn't even live past the age of 28. Lorna Simpson, she born in 1960, still alive, and consider that Basquiat, as we saw, was also born in 1960, so he could easily have lived long enough to have made a whole lot more work than he did. He really cranked out a lot in his lifetime for the short amount of time that his career lasted. But who knows what could have come of it if he had lived longer. Lorna Simpson, she is also a photographer, like Cindy Sherman and Sherry Levine that we looked at earlier. Photography as high art really kind of comes into its own in the 80s and 90s. And Lorna Simpson, as well as Sherry Levine and Cindy Sherman that we talked about before her, are at the forefront of all of that. So Lorna Simpson, excuse me, Lorna Simpson, she's a photographer, but she also does these pieces like this where text is very important. And this is an excellent example for us to look at in order to talk about postmodernism and its incorporation of text to show how a shifting of context shifts meaning. So we have a series of photographs here, right, that have been put together to look like essentially one long image divided into panels of, what appears to be a young African-American woman. Looks like she's in maybe a medical gown. It is certainly white. And both the surface that she is lying on and the wall beyond it are also very white. Right? So it feels very medical, feels very hospital-like. Right? Then, over here to the right of the line of photographs, I want to point over there, that we see these two words that have been divided. Right? Secretarial position. Right? Okay, so secretarial position. Sounds like then this person may be applying for a job. Maybe they saw a listing in the newspaper for a secretarial position, right? And is applying for it. Over here on the right, we have a list of medical exams: physical exam, blood test, heart, reflexes, chest x-ray, abdomen, electrocardiogram, urine, lung capacity, eyes, ears, height, weight. And then two bits of text above and below the photographs. Above it says "You're fine," below it says "You're hired." The title of the piece, as you can see, from 1988 is "You're fine." So we take all that in, and what it appears to be that we're seeing is something that already seems pretty icky, is the idea that this poor woman, who is African American, was applying for a secretarial position, and it looks like in order to be hired, had to go through all of these medical tests over here, right? Poked, prodded, what have you, and was told, "You're fine," as in you're healthy, you're hired. And we look at her, and she looks traumatized by it all, right? But Lorna Simpson, as a postmodernist, is rewarding us sticking around a little longer. And if we think about why some things are divided up the way that they are, and if we change how we might be looking at this, how suddenly the meaning completely and utterly changes. So you're fine, you're hired. Right? Split in that particular way. All right, well, you're fine is certainly a term that we can use to say you're healthy, right? You're in good shape. But it's also a term that is used to say that we think someone is sexy. You are fine. Damn, you're fine. You're hired. All right, now, if we take it that way, right? Now let's look at this. You're fine. You're hired. You're hot. You're sexy. I want me some of that working in my workplace. Right? Now we look over here at the secretarial position, which sure, certainly could be the position that, the job position that she was applying for, but by dividing it and making sure that we see this as two separate words, the secretarial position kind of, now that we've put this in the realm of being more like sexual attraction than health, dividing secretarial and position makes it sound like some sort of euphemism for a particular sexual position, right? The secretarial position. Yeah, we did it in the secretarial position, right? I mean, I know, like, there's this humor to it. There's also this irony to it. There's also her way to speak on how we think about African American women and their bodies. So now, as we're starting to build this story now, where the context is changing things for us into a woman who's been hired because she looks hot and she was willing to screw whoever was hiring her, now this whole list of exams over here starts to really sound gross, right? What has she been put through? And she no longer looks like someone who's lying on a hospital bed. She looks like someone who has been essentially sexually assaulted and is being told, "Damn, you're fine. You are hired. You can come and work for me. You just keep up what you're doing." Right? That's two completely separate ideas, two completely different meanings to this work. That either one is icky, and either one sort of speaks to what in 1988 and what very well could still be the case in 2021, of what it is to be an African American woman trying to join the workforce who sees you as a sexual object and nothing more. Right? That's kind of what we see Lorna Simpson speaking on here. But okay, but either one of those speaks to the hardship of being an African American woman joining the workforce. One is, if you're, in 1988, if you're an African American woman trying to get a job, you're going to be put to a much harsher scrutiny, medically speaking. And then just flip a switch in your brain to realize the way that she has separated out all these words can change the context. That context changes, and suddenly the meaning is, as an African American woman in 1988 trying to join the workforce, the people who are in charge of doing the hiring see you as a sexual object, and that's what it's like, right? And Laura Simpson was and is really good at doing this kind of thing, where she can present you with imagery and text, and have you getting multiple meanings out of it at the same time. So look a little bit at some postmodern sculpture. And we're going to look at two people in particular that represent how even within a movement, the postmodern movement, people can go to such extremes with how they approach it. We have one sculptor who's going to be representative of subtlety, calm, cool, collected subtlety, and one who's very much about excess, big, bombastic kind of work. So Martin Puryear, born in 1941, still alive, African American. He's a sculptor, and he works in what is referred to as bricolage. Bricolage is where you take a bunch of found materials and work with them pretty much as is and create them into a sculpture. So Martin Puryear is always collecting scraps of wood, wagon wheels, whatever. Like, he's just constantly collecting stuff and using that to create work. Now, the work, of course, we're going to look at is more from the 80s and 90s, but he's still doing stuff now, and is still considered pretty important here and now in 2021. This piece here is called Old Mole from 1985. And this is what I mean by subtlety. Martin Puryear, like I say, is using free collage, right? He would have found all of these strips to create and make into this piece right here that is meant to look kind of like a mole. Right? His work often communicates old African American folklore or pays homage to significant African American figures in the history of in the history of the United States for sure, but some in global some global stuff as well. But there's this subtlety to it. It's often like this, very quiet, not a lot of color, just simple materials brought together to provide a simple form. And like this piece that he calls Ladder for Booker T. Washington, this was from 1996, where he explains he had this big, long branch that had managed to get split down the middle, not completely, but far enough along it. And he thought to himself, you know what, I can split this all the way and I can turn it into a ladder. With some sort of forced perspective, it isn't actually as long as it appears right here. What it is that he has the branches a little further apart down here, the two halves of the branch, the further apart down here, and then he brings them closer and closer together and makes the spindles for the ladder feet here, the rungs, get smaller and smaller and closer as well. And again, he calls it Ladder for Booker T. Washington. So it is an homage to the great African American leader Booker T. Washington, and is indicative of one climbing on up. But again, there's this subtlety to it, right? He's allowing sort of the natural bends and curves of the branch itself to guide his decisions. There's like I said, there's not much in the way of color. All of the wood is still left natural. There's the fact that quietude and that subtlety can exist and be called modernism. Postmodernism at the same time that Jeff Koons is doing what he's doing and is being called postmodern. It gives you an idea of just how widely spread the spectrum is into which art can be called postmodern. So Jeff Koons, who, full disclosure, I'm not a big fan of the dude. Not because of what I'm about to say as far as what he makes work about. I don't care about that. I don't like his approach to art. Just know I'm not a fan of Jeff Koons. So maybe I'll get into that after we start talking about what he's up to. So Jeff Koons, in the 1980s, comes along making artwork that looks back at kitsch. I know this is his work. This is all kitsch. I wanted to define that term real quick. Kitsch, Kitsch. Kitsch is like it's a broad term, but it's like the collectible stuff. Right? It's the stuff that's on your grandma's mantle, right? It's dogs playing poker. It's these paintings of clowns, all these little tchotchkes that you might find sitting on, I guess, again, your grandma's mantle. It's, a cake plate painted with a rooster, right? This is all kitschy stuff. And by kitsch, we normally mean not to be taken seriously as a work of art, right? Koons comes along and says, well, why not? I like this stuff, right? I like silly, kitschy crap, right? Why can't that be art? And so he starts looking for ways to bring this influence into what would be his larger scale, more serious artwork. And he does so by taking the language of kitsch, right, all this thing we see, and then translating it into artwork that is larger and is made of materials that might not necessarily be the same materials as the original kitsch would have been. Like this piece right here, which is one of the pieces that really kind of launched him into the stratosphere, where people started taking note of him. This is his piece called Rabbit from 1986. And it is meant to look like a mylar balloon of a rabbit holding a carrot, looking cute in that way, right? And yet, it is larger than a mylar balloon of a rabbit might be. And it's not made of mylar. It is not inflated with air or helium or anything like that. It's concrete, at least the inside of it would be concrete, and then it has this very shiny polished metal surface that's on the outside. Much more industrial type materials applied to something that is very kitschy. This is another piece. I told you there's humor in in postmodern work, and I get the humor of Koons. I will talk briefly about why I'm not a big fan of his after I'm done talking about this. This is a piece he did of Michael Jackson and Bubbles. Right, it's meant to look like any little porcelain tchotchke, little porcelain figurines that again you might find on your grandmother's mantle above the fireplace. But again, he made it large. This is like life sized when you see it in person. But it still has all of the language of kitsch. There's that white porcelain with the gold leaf. And he used something that would have been, Michael Jackson with his chimpanzee Bubbles, that would have been considered like the cultural version of kitsch, right? This pop music icon who lives a strange lifestyle and has a pet chimpanzee that he dresses up and things of that nature, right? That can be the subject matter of it. It can take influence from kitsch, but also use industrial materials in the build and be made larger. Now, why I'm not a big fan of Jeff Koons is, okay, and understand, I've already talked to you about this in the past with other artists from the past who had workshops where they had lots of apprentices who would have worked for them in making the work, right? And so that any painting that we see by, let's say, Rembrandt during the height of his career would have been done not only by himself, but several assistants who would have painted in the portions that he didn't want to be dealt with. He would have taught them exactly how to paint like himself, right? Andy Warhol, we were just talking about today, and who we talked about in the late modernism lecture, he had what he literally called it his factory. He had a whole bunch of, in the height of his career as well, a whole bunch of people who worked for him who would create the things that he had designed and wanted to put out into the galleries and what have you. In his case, he was doing that because, again, all of his work was meant to be this comment on popular culture at the time and the industrialization that we were living through. So he's like, all right, I'll make a comment on that by also having my art produced by something not unlike industrial means. Jeff Koons takes things to an even more extreme because this dude does not make his work at all. He will have some sketches, or might even have sketches. He might just go to his art. He has a big factory of people that work for him. He might just go to them and say, hey, I would like a piece that looks like this, and describe it to them. And then they all go off to work. He goes away. They do their thing. And he comes back and approves this. Like, yes, I like that. No, I don't like that. I kind of like this, but try something else with it. Let's see what we think of that. And he leaves again and comes back. And if he were to then talk about his work like Andy Warhol, right? Because what I like about that idea is that he is kind of pointing out just how commodified art is. Right? That art has become such a commodity in the postmodern world, and now into the contemporary world as well, that he can just bring in a bunch of artists and mass produce the stuff, and people are still going to pay huge amounts of money for it. Right? It's a very bombastic way of thinking about it. And I would have a lot more respect for him if, when he talked about his work, that was how he talked about it. But he doesn't. I have seen interviews with Jeff Koons where he's standing in his factory. Over his shoulder, you can see other people making his art. And he talks about it in the interview like it's all his. Everything is his idea. There's all these great things that he's trying to communicate with them. I just don't dig his personality, I guess. Right? But he is considered extremely important, and he's still alive. He's still making work. So we got to cover it. We got to talk about it. We would be remiss if we left him out.